back. Here we are. I'm also going to speak about how HENTF, the Heritage Emergency National Task Force, can support Vermont's response and recovery efforts following major disasters. And the work that I do is not possible without partnerships and networking at the local level, up to the state level, and the federal level. In blue sky days, when preparing for disasters is a must, to dark sky days, when preparedness for those disasters turns into action. I hope you'll come away with more resources to add to your toolbox to help the whole community recover when disaster strikes. Why do we do what we do? You certainly remember the devastating fire at Notre Dame Cathedral in 2019. And this heartbreaking event, the world lost so many cultural resources imbued with the history, the knowledge, the faith, and the creativity that built this famous monument. As this tragedy so vividly demonstrated, cultural heritage is not a renewable commodity. Often, it takes a disaster of this caliber to raise awareness about cultural heritage. But disasters can and do occur at the local level, escaping international and even national attention. In April of 2019, the Loudoun County Courthouse in Loudoun, Tennessee, was engulfed in fire. Built in the 1870s, the structure is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. At the time of the fire, a complete inventory of the records did not exist. A local resident, however, was aware of the threats and challenges to record storage at the courthouse. So in 2018, he compiled a report that had recommendations for improved records retention schedules and storage. Unfortunately, the county commission decided not to move forward with the proposal. You can only imagine what was lost. And without a complete inventory, you would have to imagine, because no one will ever really know. And this is what the mayor said, quote, "We are a very fiscally sound local government. There was some money involved. It was decided not to spend it on that cause. Again, if we knew this was going to happen, I don't think there would have been any hesitation." How often are cultural resources on your radar? Our cultural resources are a link not only to our past, but also to the present and future. These resources comprise more than just archaeological sites and specimens. Cultural resources include the items represented here and much, 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 much more. Cultural and historic resources are held in the public trust by cultural heritage institutions. The institutions that embrace our cultural heritage range from arboreta and archives to arts organizations and community theater, from historical societies to houses of worship, from libraries and museums to municipal offices and zoos, and everything in between. These institutions hold the collective history of our communities, our states, our territories, and our nation. They anchor us to our community identity. They educate us. They serve as gathering places for healing and even cell phone charging. When disaster strikes a community, recovery of these very institutions can be vital for the economic, social, and artistic life of that community. And for continuity of government, we must ensure that the government offices charged with protecting our community's essential records can function and fully recover. The National Preparedness Report takes a look at the previous year, asking states and territories to rate how proficient they are in core capabilities. I'm sure many of you have had to wrangle your data to fit into the questions that are posed for the National Preparedness Report. For as long as I've been tracking the National Preparedness Report, Natural and Cultural Resources, NCR, has received very poor ratings. At the very bottom of the graphic on the right-hand side, you can barely make out that only 11% of states and territories prioritized the goal of restoring natural and cultural resources in 2018. I'd really love to know which jurisdictions those are, because every state could benefit from sharing successful approaches. A whopping 54% of states and territories placed a low priority on the restoration of natural and cultural resources in 2018. So how do we collectively stand up for cultural heritage? Well, there happens to be an entity at the federal level that waves that flag, and that entity is the Heritage Emergency National Task Force. The task force strives to increase awareness of the role of cultural heritage in our communities across the country. HENTEF, as it's fondly referred to, is that public-private partnership sponsored by FEMA's Office of Environmental Planning and Historic Preservation, which is my office, and the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative, or SCRI. HENTEF plays a role in all 5 mission areas, but its primary role is to provide response and recovery support to the cultural heritage community to mitigate the damaging effects of natural disasters and other emergencies. This is where HENTEF sits in the FEMA org chart. The Resilience org comprises 2 directorates, National Continuity Programs, and the Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration, or FIMA. Within FIMA are 4 directorates in one office, the Office of Environmental Planning and Historic Preservation, or OEHP. And within OEHP are 5 branches, which is the Readiness Branch. And within the Readiness Branch are 3 sections, and HENTEF sits in the Incident Support and Doctrine section. And right now, it's just me, myself, and I who focus on HENTEF at FEMA headquarters. I will be hiring someone new soon, so we will be doubling capacity at FEMA headquarters. These are HENTEF's objectives. I'm not going to read them to you, but 3 of the 5 objectives focus on partnerships and collaboration between the cultural heritage community and the emergency management community. One objective focuses on incorporating cultural and historic resources into planning efforts, and one objective aligns with individual assistance. And this afternoon, I'm just going to focus on 3 of them. This list shows HENTEF's 60 national service organizations and federal agencies. The 18 federal agencies are shown in red at the top, and the 42 national service organizations, private, nonprofit, professional, or trade organizations, are shown in black. IAEM and NEMA, the International Association of Emergency Managers, and the National Emergency Management Association are both members. What qualities establish membership? Each member has a network of stakeholders and the ability to push information out to their constituents. And conversely, each has the ability to gather information, such as reports of damage, from their members and pass them along to HENTEF. And what purpose does that serve? HENTEF has a formal role under the National Response Framework. HENTEF supports Emergency Support Function 11, or ESF 11, Agriculture and Natural Resources. HENTEF works closely with one of the primary agencies, the Department of the Interior, and specifically DOI's Office of Environmental Policy and Compliance, which is charged with protecting natural and cultural resources and historic properties. That's where the entree is. ESF 11 is most often activated when disaster operations require specialized cultural heritage and cultural resource support. I do want to point out that HENTEF does not have to wait for a presidential disaster declaration in order to begin working with the cultural heritage community. When responding to disasters that affect collections at museums, libraries, art galleries, and so forth, time is the enemy. As one of its objectives, HENTEF coordinates the collection and sharing of incident-specific information with federal, state, regional, and local entities to protect cultural and historic resources. When there's advance warning of an approaching event, such as a hurricane, a heads-up email is sent to the entities that are listed here. And so, most recently, in advance of Hannah and Laura and Sally and Beta, hurricane preparedness tips were disseminated through these channels to cultural institutions. So I send emails to, I send those heads up emails to the 60 delegates representing our 60 HENTEF members. I send the information to my leadership, the regional environmental officer, the Deputy Regional Environmental Officer, and EHP leadership in my office. State cultural agencies get the nod, and that would include state library, state archive, state museum, as well as state arts council, state humanities council, state historic preservation office, and state parks. The associated associations with these sectors are also notified, as are regional conservation or preservation centers. For Vermont, the closest regional conservation center, I guess, is the Northeast Document Conservation Center. And that last bullet, I can't underscore enough the value of cultural heritage emergency networks and local networks, such as the Alliance for Response Networks that are established across the country, are so valuable in response and recovery efforts because, as emergency managers are wont to say, all disasters are local. I will convene HENTF coordination calls for state cultural agencies and organizations and the cast of thousands of stakeholders that were shown in the previous slide to gather situational awareness following a disaster. What's the extent and severity of the damage to cultural institutions and arts organizations? What help do you need? I've recently convened calls following the derecho in Iowa and calls for Texas and Louisiana following the recent hurricanes. Cultural stewards, you need to know to report damage to your local emergency manager, and emergency managers, reach out to cultural stewards in your community. They're key stakeholders there to find out if damage has occurred and to determine any unmet needs. When responding to an incident, how do we know? How does a local or county emergency manager know which institutions have been affected, and just as important, which ones have not, if the full universe of institutions is not known? What you see here is a portion of the master list of North Carolina cultural institutions and arts organizations. Many years ago, North Carolina state cultural agencies pooled their lists of museums, libraries, archives, and historical societies into one list. However, with few resources to maintain them after the grant-funded project ended, the list grew somewhat outdated. Following Hurricane Dorian, North Carolina asked HENTF if we could help update that list. So I turned to Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative interns to update the data and populate missing fields. Most of the time, what was missing were the GIS coordinates. Unfortunately, such data sets don't exist across most states, and they're usually compiled after a disaster, if they're compiled at all, which, as you know, is really not an ideal time to generate lists when the stakeholders are in the throes of response and recovery efforts. Vermont hasn't had a major disaster declaration, knock on wood, since 2019, so now is the perfect time to start pulling together such a list. Following Hurricane Dorian, HENTF worked with FEMA, the Department of the Interior, and the U.S. Geological Survey staff to create an interactive, public-facing GIS map layer of cultural institutions in 3 Dorian-affected states: Florida, South Carolina, and North Carolina. Here you see North Carolina. If you click on a blue pen, up pops the identity of the institution. Such a map layer will be helpful in the future for preparedness messaging. Now we know who could be impacted by riverine flooding, storm surge, and other potential hazards. HENTF is quite willing, because HENTF, moi, I'm not doing the work, but we're quite happy to help states pull together a data set. But we hand over the list to a state agency once it's compiled. It's incumbent upon states to maintain the data, which should be updated at least annually. And the data are also valuable when an event does not rise to the level requiring federal engagement. HENTF also has a supporting role in recovery. It's a supporting organization of the Natural and Cultural Resources Recovery Support Function of the National Disaster Recovery Framework, the NCR RSF of the NDRF. So here too, we work very closely with the Department of Interior's Office of Environmental Policy and Compliance, the coordinating agency for this recovery support function. So what does all this mean? So it means that HENTF can deliver technical assistance, guidance, and resources to address disaster-related impacts to cultural and historic resources. These are two images taken in Puerto Rico following Hurricane Maria. So following Hurricane Maria, HENTF worked with the Department of the Interior, the Smithsonian, the National Archives and Records Administration, the National Park Service, and the Centers for Disease Control to bring training in mold removal and health and safety through a mechanism known as a mission assignment. So SCRI, the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative, works closely with the Department of the Interior to forge those agreements and then seeks and provides Smithsonian subject matter experts for deployment. And other federal agencies do the same. And in that way, expand access to knowledge and assistance that was certainly here really, really needed. Public assistance is the program by which private nonprofits can receive federal disaster assistance. It's a difficult program for cultural stewards to navigate, especially in the midst of trying to get one's institution back to normal, not to mention one's personal situation. The Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide, also referred to as Papa G, one of my favorite FEMA acronyms, is the reference for public assistance. Arts organizations and cultural institutions could very well be eligible for public assistance. And with funding hard to come by under the best of circumstances, it's important that cultural stewards at least explore public assistance as a means to obtain recovery funding. I encourage cultural stewards to read Papa G before a disaster, and I encourage emergency managers to connect with your cultural stewards to ensure that they're aware of this important program. Unfortunately, there's no chapter devoted specifically to cultural institutions, but you can search for museums to cover most of your bases. So search for the term museums. You can also search for culture, but a lot of the hits will be on agriculture. And at 277 pages, Papa G is also a great remedy for insomnia. The losses that result from disasters are usually tallied in dollars. But following a disaster, the losses we most keenly feel end up being the items we cherish the most. Family photographs, love letters, a wedding video, our children's artwork, the family Bible. HENTF also helps the public salvage treasured possessions in the wake of a disaster. And in this way, we're helping disaster survivors literally pick up the pieces of their lives so they can move forward. HENTF has partnered with the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative to deploy teams of preservation experts to disaster recovery centers to teach the public how to salvage their most cherished family belongings. Since 2016, SCRI has deployed teams to Louisiana, Texas, South Carolina, Nebraska, and Iowa. Nowadays, because of COVID-19, we're working with individual assistants to provide this service virtually. HENTF fact sheets were created with Smithsonian subject matter experts to help the public salvage their cherished belongings after a flood and after a fire. They're available anytime for anyone for download from HENTF's page in the FEMA Media Collection. Here is HENTF's URL on the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative website. I'll be sharing these PowerPoint slides afterwards, so you don't have to rush madly to copy any of these URLs down. One of HENTF's members is the Foundation for Advancement in Conservation. FAIC coordinates the National Heritage Responders, a cadre of about 100 preservation professionals trained to help cultural institutions salvage their collections following a disaster. The National Heritage Responders provide assistance by phone and email to collecting institutions affected by everything from leaking pipes to flooding to boiler furnace blowback. On-site assistance is sometimes possible as funds are made available. And that on-site assistance might include 1 or 2 days of assessment, organizing a salvage effort, and recommending follow-up care of affected collections. The phone number shown here is the 24/7 hotline staffed by National Heritage Responder volunteers. I'd also like to shine a spotlight on another valuable reference, the Cultural Placekeeping Guide, which is a guide for artists on how to connect with one another. But it's also a guide for planners and emergency managers on how to work with the arts community to help heal a recovering community through artistic avenues. And this just in, hot off the press yesterday. FEMA Region 2 has published 7 guides that spark ideas about how mitigation projects can be strengthened by engaging stakeholders from a wide range of sectors. And so each of their 7 guides provides insights into the role each sector plays in the community. They contain ideas for how the sector can support risk reduction planning and risk reduction projects, and they provide examples of successful collaboration for R&D, ripoff, and duplication. As I hope I've underscored, one of the keys to successfully addressing the impacts to cultural and historic resources entails emergency managers and cultural stewards working together. How do you build that relationship? Here's a resource that can start the conversation. Working with emergency responders, tips for cultural institutions. Vermont has a cultural heritage emergency network to help cultural stewards and emergency managers work together to prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters affecting Vermont's vital and vulnerable cultural heritage. To speak about this network, I'm turning the mic over to Rachel Onuf, the Vermont Historical Records Program Director at the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration. Rachel.
Lori, thank you so much, and thanks for agreeing to speak today and to put our network into the broader national context. As our local Alliance for Response, we reactivated in 2018. We used the Cultural Placekeeping Guide that Lori referenced as our guide. We got some grant funding to bring in a facilitator. And we gathered a network organizing group that consisted of folks from across the cultural heritage sector, and as well as local and state level emergency management folks. And it was important to get a lot of different voices in, and we wanted intentionally to build this as a broad a network as possible. In other states, there's often a focus on organizations that have stuff, things that could be impacted by flood and fire. But we wanted to bring in performing arts organizations and other types of arts organizations, including studio artists, because that's, again, an area where folks often are not aware of what they might be able to do in order to be better prepared and mitigate the disaster if it does happen. And we have been working in the last year or so after having our launch meeting last September. We had a day-long session of educational information, some hands-on workshops, and really launched our network. Our first order of business, because communications, as Lori has said, are so important, was to establish a website and to start reaching out on a regular basis to our mailing list, letting them know about upcoming training opportunities and other resources. And the pandemic really brought the need to do more of that outreach into really high focus. our steering committee, which has about 15 members, again, representing a broad swath of the arts and cultural heritage sector, as well as emergency management. We met, at first we met every couple of weeks, just kind of to help each other out and to hear what was happening with libraries and with historic sites and at the state archives and within the arts and culture organizations throughout the state. As co-leads, the Vermont Arts Council and the state archives really work together to try to make sure that various parts of and pieces of what we think of as cultural heritage are represented and are supported. So those meetings were important for information sharing purposes, and we've also been working on establishing regular communications with a broader network of folks, but always looking to reach out to other groups. And much as HENTEF does, we have folks who have lists. So we have the list of people with the lists and rely on them to push information out. Recently, we established a Facebook presence, largely so we are poised to be activated if we need to let folks know that there's the potential for some sort of emergency, if it's the kind of thing that we can anticipate happening, because it's potentially a weather event. And then to be able to be a space where people can interact and engage. And, Mark was talking earlier about having one person dedicated to monitoring social media. That is where we all go to find up to the minute updated information. So we're ready if we need to have an outlet there. We have that as well. And we had a great call last week with people from Massachusetts Alliance, which has been around much longer. And they really suggested we focus on goals that we can achieve. So we determined as a committee that we're going to focus on our updating our communications, increasing our communications, both our depth and our breadth with our stakeholders, and training opportunities. That was something that really came through in our organizing group meetings, as we wanted to, people want to know how to be better prepared, how to do risk assessments, how to mitigate for potential threats that they're most at risk for. And we're also looking at how we might preserve the art that artists are creating, both in response to and to help communities recover from the pandemic. So those are our goals for this year. And if you look at our website, next slide, please, Lori. The way we set it up was to try to anticipate how folks might be coming to VACDARN. Are you an emergency manager? Are you a performing arts org? Are you an individual artist? Do you work at a museum or a library? And then provide resources in those different buckets that might be useful to you. Next slide, please. But we are always looking for new collaborators and new members, and especially from this primary audience of local emergency management. We'd love to have your active engagement with our group, and we will continue to push for those who are in the arts and culture side of things to reach out to their local emergency managers and initiate those conversations, and make sure that you know about them, that the fire chief has walked through the facility, if there is a facility, knows where priority items are, if they are a collecting organization, and that relationship is established again during the blue sky times in advance of the actual disaster. That's all I have to say. But please be in touch. We'd love to engage with you, and I'm really grateful for this opportunity to speak a little bit about our local network here in Vermont. Thanks, Lori.
Thank you, Rachel. And I have to say, from my federal perspective and seeing how other networks are set up, it was so refreshing to see Vermont openly embrace arts organizations and make them a priority just as much as museums, libraries, and archives, because they are really the lifeblood of our communities. And here is my contact information. I'm Lori Foley of the Heritage Emergency National Task Force. Thank you.
Lori, thank you so much. And Rachel, thank you as well. I know you've been with us at the Emergency Preparedness Conference a couple of times now, so it's always great to see you. So thank you to both of you for coming and presenting. I know a couple of years ago, Rachel, when you first approached me about, being involved with historical records and different things, I was like, that's something in emergency management that I've never really considered. And so the last few years, I've really tried, when I talk to municipalities about emergency preparedness, try to say, reach out to, historical records, your historical society, your cultural organizations, get them involved, because they really are a critical resource in your community. So thank you both. At this time, folks, we got a number of folks on. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, but if you have questions, feel free. You can unmute yourself. You can ask questions. You can type questions in the chat, and Brittany or I are here to read that chat and go over that. So questions, folks? Questions for Lori or for Rachel? I'm not seeing any, which isn't necessarily a bad thing.
And I'm not hearing any.
Okay. So what we'll do, folks. Oh, wait, I see a little bubble. I see something popped up. Stacy Pomeroy asks, how do these sites get identified in towns' hazard mitigation plans? Ooh, good question.
The question, actually, the basic premise is, are these sites identified in the town's hazard mitigation plan? And it's not all on the hazard mitigation planners. It's not all on the schmoes to be able to figure out who those entities are. It really requires people within the cultural community, within the arts community, to make an effort to attend these meetings, to raise their hand, to make their presence known. Any kind of hazard mitigation plan, any kind of plan is certainly strengthened when the opportunity occurs to incorporate really the whole community. And this is a sector that is often neglected, not intentionally, but it's just not one that raises the flag and isn't as strenuous and isn't as obvious, quite frankly. And it has suffered dramatically as a result of this pandemic.
All right, thank you. Other questions? Feel free to type them into the chat, or you can unmute yourself.
Hi there. What other kinds of public assistance training can be provided by the, well, I guess I'll read through the POPG document, but I wondered if you could rattle some off. Just we're curious at my organization on how we can access some of the funding that's available right now.
It's only available following a major disaster declaration. So if there is no open disaster declaration, the money just isn't there to be accessed. It's directly related as a result of the Stafford Act to a specific disaster. And so someone from Vermont Emergency Management would know better about whether there is a web page about public assistance. Oftentimes, state emergency management agencies won't list anything about public assistance. They'll hide that page because they aren't engaged in it right now. The training for that, really, there isn't any particular training. The closest on delivery time, which is not really the most effective for cultural institutions, is to be kept apprised of the applicant briefing schedule if and when a major disaster is declared, because that's when the emergency management agency will actually explain the whole process to you. You can ask those questions. But it really, that happens after a disaster, and you want to have a better handle on what's going on now. you can flip through. There isn't a lot, unfortunately, there isn't a lot written about cultural institutions within Papa G. So searching for museums or searching for culture, you'll find all the references.
Thank you.
Eventually, when I have more copious free time, I wanted to write some more about public assistance, specifically targeting the private nonprofit cultural world, and how, what essentially extracting what's in Papa G for people to be able to read more easily.
Hi, Lori. Could you just talk about, what, after a disaster, you mentioned some of the resources that responded to Louisiana and Puerto Rico. And so for the folks that are on the line here, they may be wondering, well, how do I access those resources after a major flooding event? Can you talk a little bit about that? And I can probably add in some from the CDOC perspective.
Certainly. So if there's something that's spinning up, like if there is a hurricane coming, like Irene is going to be over there. I wasn't working for FEMA at the time, but I'm watching what's going on, as is everybody else at FEMA. And so in advance of those kinds of events, I will reach out to the state cultural agencies and say, we are here to support you. And then I will, with some preparedness tips. And then on the other side, when you've come out on the other end, I will reach out again to the cultural agencies and the State Emergency Management Agency, and we'll convene calls based on what I can sort of glean from people on the ground. So in this instance, I would be reaching out to Rachel and VACDAR and saying, what do you hear? What do you know? Who has been impacted? Have you heard from everybody? Have you heard from nobody? Which is always a terrible sign. And so it's sort of an organic progression. If it sounds like we really need to have that kind of coordinating call specifically for cultural resources and historic resources, I am always happy to convene that call. And then questions can be asked, people can be directed. Oftentimes it's like, who do I contact at FEMA? And you could always contact me at FEMA. I will always reply to you, and we'll make sure that the resources that you need can be directed your way. HENTF has no budget. I have no funding. So I rely extensively on both our HENTF members to provide the subject matter expertise, as well as our federal partners to be able to provide the help that you might need, whether it's identifying specifically public assistance categories for which you'd be applicable, or other non-federal resources. That's part of the charge of the Department of the Interior, trying to figure out in recovery what other resources are out there that aren't just federal funding, federal resources.
And this is also a space where VACDARN could be mobilized to respond if it's a need for bodies to move damaged goods out of one space and into another. We also have conservators and other collections care people involved in our group, including there's two National Heritage responders here in Vermont, MJ Davis and Carolyn Friesa, who are both paper conservators. And they, so we do have expertise right here as well. And we're happy to be contacted.
And my role at FEMA, as is everybody's role at FEMA, is we're here to support the state. So I'm not just going to start directing people to, start calling the cultural agencies in Vermont. I'm going to reach out to VACDAR and say, do you need HENTF support? What can we do? Do you want, if it's a widespread event and you don't have the capacity to staff a phone bank to call every single institution, we could probably help you do that. So making you aware of the resources that are available is really important so we can support your efforts. We're not going to be directing them.
Thanks so much, Lori, and thanks, Rachel, for talking with us about this today. Thanks.
Thank you.
So while we've been talking, a couple of things have popped up in the chat, just so folks are aware. Let's see. We will start at the top. Ben Rose is our Recovery Mitigation Section Chief for Vermont Emergency Management, and he posted a link to our PA funding page on our website. So that is in the chat. Also, Brian Collins is our FEMA integration team person, who he's a FEMA employee stationed here in Vermont with Vermont Emergency Management. And he let me know that there is PA training available from FEMA, an independent study, training.fema.gov, and he actually posted a specific link right below that. And Ben also posted about hazard mitigation funding. And there's a conversation going on about how we get local towns to do and to include these cultural organizations, as well as the funding available through the new BRIC program from FEMA. So that information, yes, Ben.
It's Ben. If people scroll down through the hazard mitigation page, there's information about the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, or BRIC program, and the deadlines for submitting projects for that on the hazard mitigation page.
Great, thank you, Ben. I appreciate that. Other questions or comments?